7 edges. And this is an example of a simple graph. And below that, you see the most important matrix that we are going to be dealing with, the adjacency matrix. So it's a square matrix. The rows and columns are indexed by the vertices, and you put a 1 if two vertices are adjacent and 0 otherwise. So it's a symmetric matrix. And there are other matrices. Laplacian matrix is a big competitor, but that those properties have evolved somewhat recently compared to algebraic this adjacency matrix. So graph theory, as we know, they say it goes back to Königsberg bridge problem of Euler, but that's quite old. So the modern graph theory, I would say, begins with the textbook of Koenig, I think in the early 1900s. And adjacency matrix is quite old, especially mathematical chemists were fond of this matrix, and there were several conjectures and so on. So spectral graph theory is the study of relationship between properties of the graph and which can be inferred from the eigenvalues mostly, but we can also look at the determinant and some other properties. And so there's some background that in organic chemistry, the energy levels of certain molecules are essentially the eigenvalues of the graph. I don't know much about it, but and the wave function, but it is a fact that even now there is a journal called Match Mathematical Chemistry, and that has several papers on the spectral graph theory even now, and many of the graph theory work is published in relation with mathematical chemistry. Okay, so the adjacency matrix is obviously symmetric. It's a matrix of 0 and 1 only. The diagonal elements are 0. So eigenvalues are real. And first few elementary functions, symmetric functions, can be given graph theoretic interpretation. Or rather, the first sum is just 0. But if you take the sum of squares, so this is where immediately graph theory starts to make its appearance. And this is very easy to see that if you take the sum of squares of the eigenvalues, it is the trace of a squared, and it is 2 times the number of edges, because each one will contribute to the sum of squares and so on. And the sum of cubes, in a moment I will justify this, it is 6 times the number of triangles. Triangle just means a graph with a complete graph with 3 vertices. After this it gets complicated, 4th power and so on. And paths and walks, so path means you just travel around the graph in any fashion. You start at 1, so here is a path, 1, then 4, then 5, then 3, no restriction, or 4, 3, 2, 1, that's a path. There's another word which is walk, where there is really no restriction. In a path, sometimes we put or I'm going to put a restriction. This is the sort of a convention, but it varies from different sources. In a path, nothing vertices cannot repeat, but in a walk they can repeat. So 4 to 3, 3 to 1, 1 to 2, again to 3, and so on. Now these have linear matrix theory interpretation. So if you look at a square of the adjacency matrix, then the way the square is defined, it is summation ai k a k j. So as soon as you have a 1 from from I to k, if there is an edge, and from k to j there is an edge, then that will contribute 1 to this sum. And so it is the number of walks from I to j of length 2. Length means the number of edges. And in general, the ij element, if you take the kth power, then that is the number of walks from I to j of length k. So that is one connection with graph theory right in the beginning. And this has a lot of application. This comes up a lot in the spectral graph theory, or rather also algebraic graph theory. And so the number of closed walks is given by the summation I equal to 1 to n, the diagonal element. So if you go back one slide, so here I have the ij element, and here also the ij element. So ij element of a to the k is the number of walks from I to j of length k. But if I is equal to j, then you have walks from I to I, which we call closed walks, and that is all the closed walks, that will be the sum of all the diagonal elements of a to the power k, and that is the trace of a to the power k. Okay, the number of triangles I said I will justify. So if you take, see, every triangle gives rise to 6 closed walks, because you can start at any vertex and you go around in once clockwise and once anti-clockwise. Those are considered as 2 different walks because of the order. And so it gives rise to 6 closed walks. From any vertex, there will be 2 walks, one in each direction. And so totally there are 6 closed walks. So the trace of a cube is 6 times the number of triangles. After this, again, it's not so easy, a to the power 4 and so on. Okay, just given the eigenvalues, one can determine a number of things without ever looking at the graph. So if I just write down the eigenvalues, you can immediately see, obviously, number of vertices, that is just the number of eigenvalues. Number of edges, we saw it is the trace of a square. Number of triangles, we just now saw, number of closed walks. Whether the graph is bipartite. So a graph is bipartite if there are, I think I'll just illustrate, there are 2 parts in which the vertices are divided. Here is one part and there's another part, and all the edges they go across, then it is called bipartite. There are no other edges within, there are no edges within the set, and if all such edges are drawn, it is called a complete bipartite graph, that we usually denote by KMN. M vertices in one and N vertices in the other part, and that's a bipartite graph. So it is a little surprising that this can also be determined from the spectrum, but there is a small theorem that if a graph is bipartite if and only if the eigenvalues are symmetric around the origin. It requires a short proof, but so just looking at the graph, if the eigenvalues are symmetric, like +5, -5, and so on, all of them, there can be 0 also. Then and only then it is bipartite. The graph is regular if all definition is that all the vertex degrees are equal, and if this can also be determined. One reason is that when all the vertex degrees are equal, all one vector is an eigenvector, and some Perron-Frobenius theory also comes into play, and then one can determine whether it's regular. So I'm not giving the complete test, but it's possible. Okay, the distance between 2 vertices is the length of a shortest path, number of edges, and the diameter of a graph is the maximum distance. And I'm not going to say much about the distance or the distance matrix, but one interesting result in elementary spectral graph theory is that this is based on basically the looking at the minimal polynomial, because as you can see, the powers of the matrix are related to these walks and so on. So minimal polynomial is closely related with the study of the powers of the matrix. So if you have a graph with eigenvalues lambda1 up to lambda n, then the number of distinct eigenvalues exceeds the diameter. So this is quite an interesting connection, because on the face of it, there doesn't seem to be any connection, but it is related to the diameter. And in particular, if you have a graph with a, like if you take the complete graph, so complete graph has 0 on the diagonal and 1 outside the diagonal. So it has only 2 distinct eigenvalues. But the small number of distinct eigenvalues means the graph is highly symmetric. And that has something to do with this number of distinct eigenvalues and the diameter. Okay, so yeah, the graph with a small number of distinct eigenvalues are very frequently highly symmetric. And they also have a small diameter. Actually, graph with 2 distinct eigenvalues is only the complete graph. After that, there are some studies with of graphs with 3 distinct eigenvalues and so on. Okay, so I have decided to sort of take these 4 topics or 4 theorems, and these are sort of, they're quite disjoint from each other, but they all have a common theme that they all have to deal with, they deal with the adjacency matrix, spectrum, and so on. And I have also one recent result. Initially, I was planning a complete talk on this Huang's recent proof, but that is difficult because that requires a good understanding of the computer science background. And when I come to that, I'll mention it again, that the link between the computer science conjecture, the original conjecture problem is in computer science, and the link between computer science and linear algebra is somewhat vague. I mean, you really need to understand the complexity theory and sensitivity and so on to appreciate the connection. But once the connection is made, then the result is purely graph theoretic, And the proof is really simple linear algebra. So that's what I want to talk about. So I decided not to make a complete talk on this topic, but on YouTube you will hear this, given by some computer scientist persons. And it is also coming in textbooks now. The Huang's proof is coming in textbooks. It's a quite an exciting recent development.
This is just three, 4 years old, right?
It is. The paper came in Annals of Mathematics in 2019. Okay. Yeah, July 2009. Okay, so let me start with, so these are the problems I'll consider. Isomorphic graph determined by the spectrum. Then this is an interesting, commonly presented in undergraduate colloquium, that the complete graph on 10 vertices cannot be decomposed into 3 copies of the Peterson graph. I'll show you the Peterson graph. Then a non-singular graph. Non-singular graph means the adjacency matrix is non-singular. So non-singular graphs cannot be characterized in general, but for trees, it is very interesting characterization. And then Huang's proof. Okay, so isomorphic graphs, I think we all know, if 2 graphs have the same picture, when you draw the picture, if the same picture represents 2 graphs, then they're isomorphic. In more formally, there should be a bijection between the set of vertices of one graph to the other, such that the edges are preserved. And so essentially they are the same up to a relabeling of the vertices. And it's not easy to decide. It's a very hard, I mean, it's considered an open problem to have a test for deciding whether 2 graphs are isomorphic, because you will have to, brute force method is useless, because you will have to take the adjacency matrix and apply a row permutation and an identical column permutation and see whether you get the adjacency matrix of the other graph. And that's impossible for a large number of vertices, even moderately large number of vertices. Isomorphic graph. So isomorphic graph just means in the terms of adjacency matrix, if you have adjacency matrix A1 and A2 of 2 graphs, then if A1 is equal to a permutation matrix times P times its transpose, then they are isomorphic, if and only. It's a relabeling of the vertices. So, and so therefore they have the same eigenvalues. And now the question is whether the converse is true. So in mathematical chemistry, actually they went on making all sorts of conjectures, and they said, okay, yes, if 2 graphs have the same eigenvalue, then they're isomorphic, but it was shot down immediately. And the standard example is this: top graph has 5 vertices, the bottom graph has also 5 vertices, but they are not at all isomorphic, as you can see. This has an isolated vertex, this doesn't. But the eigenvalues are the same, 2, -2, 0, 0, 0. Then somebody asked, so graph theorists really took upon this problem. They were looking for problems. So they said, oh, one is connected, one is not connected. We don't like that. So then they made it connected counterexample also. So all kinds of counterexamples are there, where the 2 graphs are highly restricted, but they have the same eigenvalues, but they are not isomorphic. I think even now counterexamples, more and more counterexamples keep coming. Okay, so a graph is said to be determined by the spectrum. If it is determined, that means any graph with the same eigenvalues is isomorphic. So now the question comes, which graphs are determined by the spectrum? So let me repeat, a graph is determined by the spectrum if any graph with the same eigenvalue is isomorphic to that graph. And deciding whether a graph is determined by spectrum or not, it has to be done on a case-by-case basis, and usually it is complicated. So if I give you a very simple graph, not too many vertices, and ask whether it is determined by its spectrum, then you will have to invent techniques. Either you have to find another graph with the same eigenvalues, which is isomorphic, then it is not determined, and otherwise you have to prove. So both these things are complicated. So here are some graphs, a path on n vertices. I'm not drawing the picture, one understands what's a path. Complete graph on n vertices, complete graph, bipartite graph, nn, and a cycle. These are all determined by their eigenvalues, and each one of them takes some proof. They are not easy results. They're easy, but it takes careful proof for all of them. For example, the path has this spectrum, 2 cosine pi k upon k plus 1. This comes in the spectrum of tridiagonal metrics and numerical methods and so on. And what I'm saying is that if you give me any graph on n vertices, which has these eigenvalues, then it must be essentially the path. So that is the meaning of a path is determined by the spectrum. So Peterson graph, which will again come up in our discussion, and this is an interesting graph, provides counterexamples to many results. These colors show that it can be colored with 3 colors, but that is, I'm not going to talk about that. And Peterson graph has eigenvalues 3, 1, 1, 1, 1 5 times and -2 4 times, and it is determined by the spectrum. And the proof is quite long. I mean, maybe 1.5 pages or something. So again, it's not a. You have to use many other results and sort of pin it down, because just knowing the eigenvalues, you cannot immediately say it's a Peterson graph without going through a long argument. And so now I come to trees, and there the question again is very interesting, whether a tree is determined by its spectrum. So tree is just a connected graph without cycles. It's an important class of graphs. So this is an example of a tree. A tree on n vertices has n-1 edges and lots of other properties. And Cayley's formula, so number of labeled trees, it is n to the power n-2, and the matrix tree theorem, and so on. So, and there are several characterizations. Okay, so this is the result I want to talk about. That in Schwenk in 1973 proved that almost all trees are not determined by their spectrum. So this is an sort of a surprising result. What this means is, if you give me a tree, maybe large enough tree, then with probability 1, I can find another tree which is not isomorphic but has the same eigenvalues. Proof is not difficult, but it's interesting. It's tricky, and it uses some kind of a trick of grafting on trees and such things. This paper is easily available. Okay, so to make this more formal, we will say that a tree has a co-spectral mate if there is another tree not isomorphic to that which has the same spectrum. So if a tree has a co-spectral mate, that means it is not determined by the eigenvalues. I can find another tree with the same eigenvalues and which is not isomorphic. And now we will make an asymptotic kind of result. So let alpha, so Schwenk's result is asymptotic. So let alpha n be the number of trees on n vertices, all the number, total number, and beta n is the number of trees which have a co-spectral mate. And Schwenk's result says that this limit of beta n upon this ratio of beta n upon alpha n goes to 1 as n goes to infinity. So essentially it says what I said earlier, that if you take any random tree, then with probability 1 you will find another tree with the same eigenvalue but not isomorphic, and this is quite surprising. And for general graphs, people have looked at this problem, and there is no consensus, interestingly. Both kinds of views keep coming up, that some people think that almost all graphs have a co-spectral mate. Some people think perhaps an equal and equally powerful second group says that almost all graphs have no co-spectral mate. So in general, it's hard to decide. And as I said earlier, if you give me a graph, I cannot immediately say whether it has a co-spectral mate or not. It will either require some tricky proof to show that it doesn't, like the Peterson graph, or it will require a lot of computation. Okay, so I think this was one topic I wanted to present. The second one is kind of a puzzle. You take the complete graph on 10 vertices, and you remember the Peterson graph. So can I embed inside this complete graph on 10 vertices 3 copies of the Peterson graph? Now, if you just count the number of edges and number of vertices, you cannot get any contradiction, because the complete graph on 10 vertices has 10 choose to 45 edges. Peterson graph has 15 edges. So it is conceivable that 3 Peterson graphs will fit exactly in the complete graph. So it is conceivable that 3 disjoint copies can be put together to get K10. So matrix theory wise, this is the problem. This is the adjacency matrix of the Peterson graph. So suppose you call this as P1, then you take another permutation of this. That means P and P transpose type of permutation. That is also the Peterson graph. And then take one more and add them up, and whether you can get the adjacency matrix of the complete graph, which is here. Complete graph is J10, which is the matrix of all ones minus the identity. So this is the matrix, adjacency matrix of K10. So what you have to do is essentially fit 3 copies of this inside. So decompose into 3 copies. And here what is interesting, I don't think there's a combination. So this cannot be done. So the result is that this cannot be done. And as far as I know, there is no combinatorial proof. And the linear algebraic proof uses very well elementary linear algebra. So Peterson graph has eigenvalues, I already told you. Just remember the crucial thing that -3 is not an eigenvalue. This will be required. Okay, so what I want to do, so here is J10 minus I10. This is the adjacency matrix of the complete graph. I want to decompose it as a sum of AP plus AQ plus AR, where all these are same representing Peterson graph or its row column. It's relabeling, 2-column permutation. Okay, so let's start with this equation and try to use elementary linear algebra to get a contradiction. So if you take the vector of all ones, which I denote by bold 1, then if you pre-multiply AP, that is one of the Peterson graph, minus I10, because Peterson graph is a regular graph with degree 3. So if you subtract I, then all of them will have row sum 2. So 1 transpose times this is 2 times 1 transpose. So the kernel of AP minus I10 is perpendicular to the all 1 vector. That is one observation from here. Similarly, the kernel of AQ minus I10 is contained in the all 1 vector. And both the kernels have dimension 5. Why? Because if you look at the eigenvalue of the Peterson graph, and if you subtract 1, if you subtract identity, then this 1 will vanish. So it will have 5 zeros. So the nullity will be 5 for AP minus I. And so the rank will be 5. I really need the nullity only. So both the kernels have dimension 5 because of the, so here is one place where I have used the eigenvalues of the Peterson graph. So AP minus I10 has nullity 5 and AQ minus I10 also has nullity 5. So 5 plus 5 is 10, which is the dimension of one perpendicular. So by the usual intersection result for vector spaces, there'll be a non-zero vector in the intersection. So there's a vector W, which is not equal to 0 in both the kernels, kernel of AP minus I, as well as the kernel of AQ minus I. And this is where we start manipulating the equation. So go back. So I'm trying to contradict this equation. So I bring AR on one side and everything else on the other and multiply that by the vector W. W is in the kernel of both AP minus I and AQ minus I, or AR minus, yeah, both. So this is just a rearrange simplification. So if you multiply by W, then I have rearranged this. So J10 times W is here, then I10 W. Then I have added and subtracted one I10. This is a minus sign, not equal to. So I10 I have added and subtracted. So this is just a rewriting. And now AP minus I10 times W will vanish because W is in the null space. Similarly, this will vanish. And minus I10W minus 2I10, that will be 3W. And so I get ARW is equal to minus 3W. That means minus 3 is an eigenvalue of the Peterson graph, but it is not. So that is a contradiction. So I think this is an interesting proof which goes on using very, very basic linear algebra, but I don't think there's a combinatorial proof, or I'm not aware of a recent development, but I have not seen a combinatorial proof. So, and by the way, this is just one example. There are many, many results which are proved like this by using linear algebraic techniques. Okay, now moving on to non-singular graphs. So as I said, a graph is said to be non-singular if the adjacency matrix is non-singular. So some of the things are not easy to decide. Like we feel that it is easy. Like what is the rank of the adjacency matrix? So there is no good answer to that. Is the rank related to the properties of the graph? Nobody knows, perhaps not. As opposed to that, if you look at the Laplacian matrix, I'm not talking about it right now, but the Laplacian matrix also has very interesting properties. And there the rank is quite easy to see. The rank is the number of components. I mean, the nullity rather. The nullity is the number of components. If the graph is disconnected, then the Laplacian matrix is singular, if and only if. So Laplacian matrix, I did not define it. All you have to do is take the adjacency matrix, make the minus of that, and put on the diagonal the degrees of the vertices so that the row and column sums are 0. So that's the Laplacian. And so there's a good contrast between the properties of the two. But classically, graph theory, spectral graph theory people always give adjacency matrix. They consider that as the sort of the hero. They are not willing to look at other matrices. Other matrices, there are a number of other matrices with very interesting properties, and people are paying attention only relatively recently. Laplacian matrix, I would say, only since the work of Fiedler, which is late 60s, it got importance. And now it is very important. So, some in machine learning and all these things, Laplacian matrix is quite important. Okay, so complete graph on n vertices is non-singular. And again, characterizing non-singular graphs, I would say either it's a difficult problem or it's not a good problem. There may not be a good answer. Again, it's because I said rank is a non-singular graph, deciding whether a graph is non-singular is difficult. So determining the rank is even more difficult. Connection between rank and graph theoretic property. Okay, but trees provide a nice, always provide a nice special case and sufficiently interesting, not trivial. So which trees are non-singular? That can be answered very well. And here I want to introduce the concept of a matching. So matching is just a set of edges, no two of which have a common vertex. And a matching is perfect if all the vertices are incident to some edge. So here I have a picture where I have shown a tree with a perfect matching. So this is the tree, and the edges in red that you see, they form a matching because you can see that no two red edges have a common vertex. Not only that, it's a perfect matching because all the vertices are covered by some red edge or the other. And so not all trees have perfect matching, by the way. It is very easy to find because if you take a path, then a path will not have a perfect matching unless, so a path like this definitely has a perfect matching because this is one edge in the matching, this is one edge in the matching. But if you take a path with an odd number of vertices, then it will not have a perfect matching. Because in a perfect matching, you must take this edge because this vertex has to be covered. Then you cannot take this edge, you must take this edge, but then this is left uncovered. So perfect matching, some trees have, some trees don't have. But perfect matching, if it exists, then it is unique. That can, in a tree, that can be shown without much problem. And it turns out, so if a tree has a perfect matching, then it is unique. Proof can be given by induction, simple proof. And it turns out that a tree is non-singular if and only if it has a perfect matching. So that's a kind of necessary and sufficient condition. And now this also has inspired a lot of research about other graphs similar to trees. I mean, not too far away from trees, which have perfect, which are non-singular and so on. And it is determined by the matching. Okay, so let's look at, if you look at the adjacency matrix of a tree, then it has some special properties. It is totally unimodular, first of all. That means the determinant is plus or minus 1. All minors of any order, square minors, their determinant is also plus or minus 1. So I want to indicate a proof of this, this result because it's not difficult. A tree is non-singular if and only if it has a perfect matching. So let's look at the determinant. By the way, this formula, this simple formula for the determinant of a matrix, has inspired many, many results, and it's one of the main tools in spectral graph theory to analyze this right-hand side of this formula. So let's do that. So here I have the determinant with the sign, usual sign, and the permutation. Now, when you have a tree, lots of things happen. First of all, tree has any adjacency matrix has zeros on the diagonal. So this permutation cannot have any loops, one cycles. That is one thing. Another thing is a tree doesn't have cycles. So this permutation, I mean, whatever, so all the terms in the permutation are going to be either 0 or 1 because the entries of the matrix are 0 or 1. So this is going to be, so we have to just see which permutation give rise to a 1. And you will see that because there are no cycles, there can only be what we might call a 2 cycle. That means Aij and Aji. Only those kinds of cycles can come. And they have to be clearly disjoint. So that is why a matching comes in the picture. That means when we write sigma as a product of disjoint cycles, and note that there are no cycles of length greater than 2, it will follow that a term will contribute a 1 if and only if that permutation corresponds to a perfect matching in the tree. And once there is a perfect matching, it is unique. So there is no cancellation. So both parts are proved like that. I mean, there are no cancellations, so the determinant is non-zero. Conversely, if the determinant is non-zero, then again, look at all the terms. The non-zero terms can only come from perfect matching, and perfect matching is unique. So the tree has a perfect matching. The proof is quite simple both ways. And so, as I said, I'm not going into other results which are inspired by this, but there's a big this area of, and once we determine that, so here is one more tree with a perfect matching. One can ask about the inverse. That means suppose the tree has a perfect matching. What about the inverse? Now I said that the tree has the property that the adjacent symmetrics is totally unimodular. So the inverse also has, because in that cofactor formula for inverse, the denominator will be 1 or minus 1, the determinant. But the numerator is also 0, 1 or minus 1. So the inverse also has elements 0, 1 and minus 1. And I'm not stating this result, but that can be decided graph theoretically. That means if you look at the 1, 7 entry of the inverse, then I look at the 1, 7 path. There's a unique path, and that is not an alternating path because the edges red, blue. The red edges are the perfect matching. So the edges are going red, blue, again blue, and because of that, the entry in the inverse is 0. But if you look at 1 to 2, 1 to 3 path, then 1 to 3 path is an alternating path because red, blue, red. Then it is non-zero. And once it is non-zero, is it plus 1 or minus 1? That can also be determined by just looking at the path. So I'm not going in the full result, but I think this is the area where lots of results have come up recently that find an interpretation for the determinant, graph theoretic interpretation, and particularly distance matrix of a tree, which I'm not talking about right now, has such properties that the determinant has a graph theoretic interpretation and an inverse also has a graph theoretic interpretation. Okay, so now let me come to this Huang's recent proof. So I'm giving some very brief background about the motivation. We are looking at strings of zeros and ones, and we have a Boolean function. That means it's a function which takes a string and maps it to 0 or 1. So here is the formal definition. It's a function from 0, 1 raised to n to 0, 1. And a Boolean function can be represented by a multilinear polynomial. And so to give an example of a Boolean function, you can just give a function like this. So f of x1, x2, x3, this is an example of a Boolean function. Or there are simpler examples. One can look at the and or function. So f of x1, x2 is equal to x1, x2. That's a Boolean function. Or x1 plus x2 plus x1, x2. That's a Boolean function, and so on. So there is a rich theory of Boolean functions. And the degree of the Boolean function is obviously, I think this is a mistake. It has to be 2. I have the other one in mind. Okay, so that is the degree of the Boolean function. Now, what is the sensitivity of a Boolean function? So you take a Boolean function and take it. So I think I want to show you the picture of a hypercube first, because that is the main graph that comes into play. So a Boolean function is nothing but a map on the vertices of the hypercube. This is called a hypercube in dimension 3. Hypercube in the lower dimension will be just a square, and after this it will have 2 to the power n vertices. So the Boolean the n tuples of zeros and ones, they are just the vertices of the hypercube. And if you have a Boolean function and look at one vertex and see when you go to a neighbor, neighbor means you are just flipping. You are flipping one coordinate and see whether the value changes. And suppose it changes here, it changes here, as well as suppose it doesn't change. When you flip one coordinate, it changes, another coordinate changes, but not here. then we say that the local sensitivity is 2. And that is the definition of sensitivity, the usual sensitivity. And then the global sensitivity or the sensitivity of the function is the maximum of the local sensitivity. So more formally, xi is the vector of the bit xi flipped. Then sfx is the number of bits such that the function changes. Then the sensitivity is the maximum. Now there are other, so this is considered to be the most basic. And there are other sensitivities. One of very much related is a block sensitivity, but I won't go into the definition. It's just you do whatever we did in the sensitivity, but you do it by dividing it into blocks. So let me not go to the formal definition, but there's a block sensitivity. And the block sensitivity, because sensitivity is a more special case of block sensitivity, because you have blocks of size 1 in sensitivity. So 1 less than or equal to sensitivity less than or equal to block sensitivity less than or equal to n. And there are other kinds of sensitivities. So here I have one example. You have a 4-bit Boolean function. The output is 1 on all these tuples, and otherwise it's 0. Then let me show you why sensitivity is 2, or rather, if you look at the first tuple, if I change the first 0 into a 1, it doesn't change because there also the function is 1. But if I change the second 0, so it becomes 0, 1, 0, 0, that you don't find in this list. So the function takes the value 0. Then if you change the third 0, you get 0, 0, 1, 0. That also I don't find here. So the value of the function changes. If you change the last 0, then it doesn't change because so the local sensitivity at the first 4 tuple is 2. And you just believe me that that's the maximum. So the sensitivity is 2, and one can check that the block sensitivity is 3. Okay, now there are other kinds of sensitivity, and computer scientists have studied this, and 2 sensitivity measures are said to be equivalent. This is somewhat like norms. 2 norms are equivalent if it satisfies an inequality like this. And there are many other sensitivities, huge number of other complexity measures, decision tree complexity, certificate complexity, randomized query complexity, quantum query complexity, and so on. And what has happened in the last 40 years or so, that the block sensitivity was shown to be polynomially related to all these other measures in different papers, and lots of papers in this area. But the link between sensitivity and block sensitivity was missing. And computer scientists were greatly interested in that because that would have sort of completed the picture. Because sensitivity is the most natural, most basic of the measures. And if you show that that is related to all the other measures in terms of that norm type of inequality, then we are sort of satisfied that we don't have to look at each and every measure separately. And so they were trying to, there was a conjecture that these two are also related, and that has remained open. So hypercube, I already mentioned that hypercube in dimension n, it is exactly the n tuples are the vertices, and 2 vertices are adjacent if they differ in exactly 1 coordinate. And Qn is the notation for the hypercube of dimension n. And hypercube is a bipartite graph that you can also see from this picture, that why it is bipartite. It has no, actually a graph is bipartite if it has no odd cycles. So it has no odd cycles. And going from Qn to Qn plus 1 is somewhat very easy construction. So let me just tell you how it is done. So suppose you have one cube, this is the 3-dimensional cube. Sorry. Okay, I just one minute. So this is one hypercube. I'm not very careful. Okay, this is Q3, what we call as Q3. And how do you go to from Q3? How do you go to Q4? Well, you have another copy of Q3, and just join the corresponding vertices. Then you get a Q4. In fact, if you join the corresponding vertices like this. I'm not making all the connections. Actually, even if you look at just Q3, then as you can see, the top face is a Q2 and the bottom face is a Q2, and their corresponding vertices are joined. So this is one important matrix theoretic interpretation, that if you have the adjacency matrix of Qn and you want the adjacency matrix at the next level, all you have to do is partition it in 4 parts. Here you put the adjacency matrix of Qn, repeat it here, and you have to join the corresponding vertices. That means you have to put identity here. That's all. So there's a very elementary way to go from recursive way from to construct these adjacency matrices of the hypercube, and this is very important in the proof later on. And this was a common knowledge. I mean, everything about hypercube was well studied. Okay, so this is how you go from one adjacency matrix to another adjacency matrix. So Gottesman and Lineal provided the first link between the sensitivity conjecture and a very simple graph theory conjecture. So what is the graph theory? And this link is very not very clear. That's why I decided I cannot explain it properly. I mean, you need a lot of computer science background. Even then, it is a bit unclear. But I have not seen any seminar where on YouTube where this link is very clearly explained. There may be some. Okay, so what is the graph theoretic conjecture? So the link I cannot explain, but the graph theoretic conjecture is very easy to explain. So you take the hypercube on n vertices and take a subset of more than half the number of vertices. Vertices in the Qn are 2 to the power n. So half of that is 2 to the power n minus 1 plus 1. Then you take the graph induced by that. Induced means you just take the vertex set and take all the edges that come along with it. Actually, in terms of adjacency matrix, you just take the submatrix, principal submatrix determined by those vertices. And in that subgraph, you look at the highest degree, highest vertex degree. And that is at least square root of n. That was the conjecture. So it is very easy to explain, it is very easy to see why it is true for a usual cube in 3 dimensions. So if you take a cube in 3 dimensions, here is the cube, forget about this. Then I need to choose any, because there are 8 vertices, so I need to choose at least 5 vertices. So suppose I choose any 5 vertices, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and take the subgraph induced by that, then you will find here is one vertex with not that one, with degree at least 3. Difficult to see right now, but there are 5 vertices. So I want a vertex of degree at least 3, and I'm sure it is there. But
the back one on the right.
This one?
That has no. That has 2.
Okay, so yeah, I don't know what's going wrong. Yeah, I'll come back to it maybe about it. But that is the conjecture. So that if you take only 4, then it doesn't work, because you can take the 4 vertices on the top. But okay, I'm sorry, I don't see it right now. But I'll come back maybe to see it. Okay, so this was the proof. This was the conjecture. And Huang used only 2 ideas. One was the Cauchy interlacing theorem, which is a classical result, that if you have a real symmetric matrix, then if B is a principal submatrix, then the eigenvalues interlace. So that is a well-known result. And the only second idea that he used, so if you go back to this adjacency matrix which I showed, so the adjacency matrix of a cube, the eigenvalues are well determined. They are actually, because it's a regular graph with degree n minus 1. So n minus 1 is one eigenvalue, minus eigenvalues are symmetric because it's bipartite, and these in between are also integers. But as you can see, it's quite well spread out. I mean, it's not in a narrow band, and that is what difficulty. So what Huang did was that there is a notion of you go to a signed graph. That means you put a negative sign on some of the edges. Other edges you keep as they are. And if you put a negative sign, then in the adjacency matrix, you should put a -1. So a -1 in the symmetric places. That means ij place -1 and ji place also -1.
Bapat,
Yeah,
sir,
yeah.
you have to take only square root of n, which is square root of 3 in this case, which is 1.732. So you just need 2. You don't need 3.
Oh, okay, okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah. That was the reason. Yeah. But with 4 vertices, it will not work. That also you can see.
Yeah.
Okay, that's best possible. Thank you. Perfect. Okay, so the idea of a sign graph is also a classical idea. A lot of work is there. And what Huang said that let's put signs systematically in some of the edges so that this shrinks. It shrinks quite a bit. It shrinks to √n and -√n. And what is the way to do that signing? It's extremely simple and elegant. All you do is you do it recursively. That means here is the first adjacency matrix of an edge. A simple edge is also a hypercube. 2 tuples of 0 and 1. So this is the basic adjacency matrix. Then you want to go to the next one, you just put a negative sign in this lower block. So that's all the signing you have to do. So put that. So this almost looks like the adjacency matrix, but I have put a negative sign. So recursively, when you do it, the negative signs will keep growing, and you will get some matrix of a signed graph. But fortunately, the eigenvalues of this are extremely easy to determine because the square of that turns out to be n times identity. Just multiply. Actually, the second technique is so simple that it's hard to imagine because I think, okay, so let me, yes. So if you take the square, you get n times identity, very easy by induction. Just multiply, it pops out. And so the eigenvalues are square root of n and minus square root of n, but the trace is 0. So the multiplicity must be equal. So square root of n comes with multiplicity, very high multiplicity, 2 to the n minus 1, and minus square root of n with multiplicity 2 to the n minus 1. So this was a very simple, crucial observation. This essentially finishes the proof because if you go back to, okay, so that's this result. And now basically what you have to do is, so one small bound on the largest eigenvalue. So if you have like going back to, you don't need a full Perron-Frobenius theory. It is something like Perron-Frobenius theory. If you take a non-negative matrix, then the spectral radius is bounded by the largest row sum on the top and smallest row sum. If you take a symmetric matrix only, then the largest eigenvalue is bounded above by the maximum row sum of the, you make it into a, take the absolute value of all the elements and you get a non-negative matrix. So it is a very simple proof. Okay, so if you have a symmetric non-negative matrix, then by Perron-Frobenius theory, the spectral radius is less than or equal to the largest row sum. And row sum, remember, corresponds to this vertex degree. Because if you take a subgraph, that will be a principal submatrix, and the row sum of that is nothing but those are the degrees. Okay, so this is a very simple bound, the maximum row sum. And now one can essentially finish the proof like this. So the idea is, so let me repeat the theorem that let H be an induced subgraph of Qn with 2 to the n minus 1 plus 1 vertices. The delta H denotes the largest degree in the induced subgraph, and that is at least square root of n. And what I will do is first I will go to the adjacency, that means the sequence I defined, the adjacency matrix of the signed graph. And apparently people found out, okay, I'll make some remarks later maybe. Okay, so that this is what I did in that recursive construction. And if you remove the minus signs, you are back in the adjacency matrix of the cube, hypercube. So mod an is just the adjacency matrix. And an has eigenvalues √n and minus √n with multiplicity 2 to the n minus 1 each. So if I delete a small number of edges, then by interlacing the eigenvalues will remain, the largest eigenvalue will remain intact. Like if you take the hypercube and for the signed adjacency matrix, if you delete only one row and column, by interlacing, root n is going to remain the largest eigenvalue. You can go up to half the number because the multiplicities are half. So if we delete less than half rows and corresponding columns, the resulting principal submatrix will still have root n as the largest eigenvalue. So actually in the proof, this is equality for the signed adjacency matrix, but for the unsigned, it may change. So a principal submatrix of size 2 to the n minus 1 plus 1 will still have root n as the largest eigenvalue by interlacing. And if H is an induced subgraph, then because of this bound between the largest eigenvalue and the largest row sum, it will be true that the largest row sum, delta H, that is definitely going to be, let me make it, yeah. So if delta H is the largest row sum of the corresponding principal submatrix of mod an, that means the original adjacency matrix, then it is greater than or equal to square root of n. So it is really very, I hope this is clear. I mean, we went a little fast. I did not write this formally, but the idea is that to use the signed adjacency matrix and then apply interlacing for that submatrix. Okay, so this has resulted in a lot of activity. I think the computer science, I'm not a criticism or anything, but the linear algebraic techniques are sort of ignored because perhaps their background, they have not seen a lot of such techniques, but so nobody has given any thought to using very elementary. Of course, the proof is elegant and brilliant, but it's quite elementary that way. So then after that, there was a lot of activity. Then people said, why just cubes? Why not some other graphs, apply similar methods? And somebody discovered that this signed adjacency matrix was there earlier in some other context. And it has now, this Huang's conjecture is coming in textbooks also. And it has come in some textbooks in print. And you can find more on the internet that about the latest history of Huang's conjecture. Huang is a young, I think, maybe before this he was associate professor in Emory University in Texas. I don't know after this conjecture. Okay, so the concluding remarks, as we have the interplay between the combinatorial properties and linear algebraic properties of the associate matrices. I have only dealt with the adjacency matrix. And for references, the classical book by Bix, which has gone into the second edition, is also quite old, but it is more different from the first edition. So Bix is an important book in this area. Wurtzel and Royal is also a very important book. I have this book, Graphs and Matrices, and Huang's paper has appeared in Annals of Mathematics in 2019. Okay, so I can stop with that.
Okay, thank you very much. Any queries or comments?
Can I ask?
Yeah, please.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was really nice talk. Really enjoyed it. So I had two questions, Professor. One, so we said something using spectrum theory. We looking at the spectrum, we made some remarks about like symmetry of the graph being symmetric. So could we also talk about something like whether it's a Euler path or circuit or Hamiltonian path or circuit, looking at the spectrum?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, going back to the usual graph theory, earlier years I have not, but recently there have been papers by Fiedler and some co-authors in the last 6 to 10 years on Hamiltonian, some connection between spectrum and to decide whether a graph is Hamiltonian. Euler graph, no, because Euler graph already has a very simple characterization. But if you make a search in the usual linear algebra journals for connection, Fiedler's papers with co-authors, yes, I have seen some papers, but it's not, it's some isolated type of result that if something happens in the spectrum, then the graph is Hamiltonian. But not a big theory as such, only a beginning.
one more thing, quick clarification, Professor. So when you're saying induced subgraph, you mean like say if Q is the graph, then H is induced subgraph. Then if the vertex set is subset of Q set and S set is a subset of Q set, right?
No,
Q
that is not
H set.
induced. That is not induced. That is a subgraph. So let me show it here. I'm sorry, pen is behaving strange. I have to just, perhaps now it will be okay. Sorry. So here is a graph. So if you take any subset of the vertices and any subset of the corresponding edges which are using those vertices, that's a subgraph. Okay, but that's not an induced subgraph. So for an induced subgraph, you only decide the number of vertices, and the number of the edges will be automatically determined. So maybe I'll show it with this kind of thing. Suppose this is a, so if you take these four vertices, and okay, so if I take, let me have one more edge. So if I take, for example, this vertex, these three vertices. If I take this vertex, this vertex and this vertex, and if I take only this edge, then it's a subgraph. Okay, do you see that? These three vertices and only this edge, but that's not induced because I must also take this edge which comes along with that vertex set. So induced means once you decide the vertex set, the edge set is automatically determined. Whatever comes with those vertices you must take. And this has a simple linear algebra interpretation that you take that subset and take the corresponding principal submatrix completely. Don't omit any edges. I hope it's clear.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Professor.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, so just one thing. So you said something like this, right? From adjacency matrix to decide whether two graphs isomorphic or not.
Yeah.
It's a kind of open problem, or I did not.
Yeah. People say from the adjacency matrix, one brute force method is there. You take all permutations. That means you try all relabelings. You try all the row and column permutations and test each time whether you use a permutation of the rows, similar permutation, same permutation of the columns, and see whether they have the same eigenvalues. If they have, then you have found that they're not isomorphic. So yeah, what was the question? Yeah, whether to decide two graphs are isomorphic. So you look at the adjacency matrix of the two graphs, A1 and A2, and decide whether A1 is obtained from A2 by a P and P transpose permutation. And so the brute force method is there, but that will take forever, even for small number of vertices. So there is no good algorithm or good test to decide whether two graphs are isomorphic in a reasonably efficient way. And people have been working on it. And occasionally people say that there's a breakthrough, but then some loophole is there.
And another thing in this context, that if you have large graph like social network graph or something like that,
yeah,
you have two large graphs, and if you want to devise a statistical test to decide whether these two graphs are isomorphic or not, some work in that context.
Yeah, there is some algorithmic work, and whether I don't know whether it involves statistical test, but there is some heuristic work, and maybe it involves some, but I'm not very sure. It may involve some probabilistic argument. And, I mean, some work is there, some kind of algorithmic work is there on deciding whether two large graphs are isomorphic. I'm not aware of the recent development.
Nice.
Yeah.
So just a comment, I think Babai had announced some kind of algorithm.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that people keep announcing, but then there is no final confirmation that it is correct. So even now that Babai's thing, I don't think I have seen a complete confirmation of that. The people do keep announcing, but that's still not done.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay, then let's thank the speaker.